It began under gray skies in Baltimore. The university auditorium was packed students with cameras, journalists clutching notebooks, quiet government observers in pressed suits lining the back rows. Outside, protesters clashed with counter-protesters. Inside, a sense of unease settled over the crowd. Everyone knew something unusual was about to happen. There was no moderator, no polished introduction, just a spotlight on a bare stage and a microphone. At precisely 7 p.m., J.D. Vance stepped into the light. He didn't wear a tie, sleeves were rolled up. He looked tired but determined. The murmurs in the room faded to silence. He didn't start with a speech. He simply said, "Tonight, you won't hear from politicians. You'll hear from people who've lived the truth most of us are too afraid to admit." Then he stepped aside. One by one, the witnesses came forward. First, a former systems analyst from a government subcontractor described how keyword tracking AIs were trained not just to detect threats, but to reshape search results based on political sentiment. Then, a linguist once employed by a federal data initiative spoke about how language models were subtly adjusted to discredit opposing views, shifting entire online debates without ever drawing attention. A third speaker, young and nervous, admitted to working on Echo 19 ChatGPT, said, "The evening air in Washington, D.C. was thick with summer heat and political tension." Senator J.D. Vance had just stepped out of a long, bitter debate on Capitol Hill. His aides, tired and silent, followed him into a quiet street where the lights of a popular upscale bistro glowed warmly through tall windows. It was a place of fine dining and quiet conversation, a temporary escape from the sharp edges of the Senate floor. As Vance entered, the clinking of glasses and murmured laughter filled the room. He gave a polite nod to the hostess and offered his name. She smiled, at first clearly recognizing him, but as she checked the system, her smile slowly disappeared. Her eyes darted nervously toward the back of the restaurant. "Just one moment, Senator," she said, disappearing through swinging kitchen doors. Minutes passed. The air shifted. Staff behind the counter exchanged glances. A bartender whispered something to a server. A couple at the bar looked up from their drinks. Vance stood still, calm but alert. His aides began to notice too. The hostess didn't return. Instead, a tall man in a dark apron approached, clearly the manager. He walked with the stiffness of someone preparing for confrontation. "Senator," he said with a tight smile, "I'm afraid we won't be able to serve you tonight." Vance's eyebrows lifted slightly. "May I ask why?" said in a steady voice. The manager shifted on his feet. "Our company holds certain values and, after careful consideration, we believe it's in the best interest of our staff and guests that we decline service." There was no mention of reservations, no problem with the table. The meaning was clear. Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. So he asked, "Is this because of who I am or what I believe?" The manager hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "We just want to make sure everyone feels safe and welcome," he said. A hush fell over the room. Patrons began to watch closely now, some pulling out their phones. One woman in the corner tapped record. Vance stood still for a long moment, then slowly nodded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound item. It was a pocket-sized copy of the U.S. Constitution. He placed it gently on the hostess stand. It guarantees the right to speak freely, even when that speech makes others uncomfortable. He said, loud enough for nearby diners to hear, "You may not agree with me, but denying a seat at a table won't silence ideas." He turned and walked toward the exit. Phones followed him. His aides scrambled behind, whispering in confusion. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, a young man, holding his phone, captured the final moment. J.D. Vance standing beneath the restaurant sign. The Constitution still visible behind the glass. Within an hour, the video hit social media. The title read, "Senator J.D. Vance denied service at D.C. Bistro, leaves behind the Constitution." Comments exploded. Some called it courage. Others accused him of staging it. Politicians began weighing in. Cable news picked it up for debate. By midnight, CBS was the first network to air the footage during a breaking news segment. The anchor began to frame the event as part of a growing national divide. But before the segment could finish, the feed cut suddenly. "We're experiencing technical difficulties," the screen read. Inside CBS headquarters, a producer's email leaked just moments later. It read, "Stop airing. Order under National Editorial Security Guideline." The public didn't know what that meant, but something had changed. And J.D. Vance had just become the center of a political storm. The clip of J.D. Vance leaving the restaurant with quiet defiance had been online for less than 12 hours before it came the top trending story across the country. Every newsfeed, every screen, every conversation seemed to mention it. But something else was happening too, something underneath the surface. The video's sudden removal from CBS's nightly broadcast raised more questions than answers. Social media lit up with speculation. Why had they pulled the story? Who had ordered it? And why label it National Editorial Security? By morning, whispers had turned into theories. Conservative commentators called it censorship. Liberal voices urged caution, suggesting the footage was being weaponized. But no one could ignore one fact. A sitting U.S. senator had been denied service at a public restaurant, and the media seemed afraid to talk about it. Inside J.D. Vance's Senate office, the energy was chaotic but focused. Aides juggled media requests, while others combed through hateful messages and praise, pouring into the inbox. Vance sat quietly at his desk, watching the video again, frame by frame. He wasn't smiling, not even a little. "Senator," his communications director said, stepping in, "CNN just canceled your interview. MSNBC too. They're saying you've become too hot to touch." He didn't respond. He simply stared out the window toward the Capitol dome, lost in thought. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A reporter from an international news channel, Al Jazeera English, reached out directly to Vance's team. They offered a long-form, uncut interview. No scripts, no filters, just the truth. It was a risk. But Vance agreed. The interview took place in a quiet hotel conference room in D.C. Neutral ground, cameras rolled, lights dimmed. Interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman named Layla Cowrie, greeted him with a firm handshake and calm confidence. "Senator," she began, "before we talk about the restaurant, I want to ask something broader. Do you believe there's a coordinated effort to silence political speech in America?" Vance didn't blink. "Yes," he said. "And it's no longer about policy. It's a blink. It's about free speech," she had said. "No, it's about controlling doubt itself. People don't know what to believe. They become easier to steer." That was when the feed flickered. For viewers online, the stream cut out, replaced with a blue screen and the message, "Connection lost. Please refresh." But inside the room, the mic still worked. The cameras were still rolling. Independent journalists scrambled to preserve their footage. J.D. Vance stepped back to the mic. He looked out at the audience and paused. His voice, when it came, was low and calm. "We knew this might happen," he said. "We knew they'd try to shut this down." He held up a flash drive. "But every word spoken here tonight is saved, encrypted, distributed, and tomorrow it will be everywhere." He looked straight into the cameras. "I don't care if you believe me, but believe this: what we allow to be buried today becomes the blueprint for what controls us tomorrow." At that moment, several figures began moving toward the stage. Security officials. No one was sure. The room tensed. But then something happened. One of the security guards stepped aside. Then another. And another. They weren't there to stop him. They were protecting him. The last speaker of the night was a teenage girl, a college freshman. She had no ties to politics, no job in government. She simply said, "I used to think truth was whatever people," shouted the loudest. Now I realize truth is what they try hardest to erase. The room stood still. Then came applause. Not the polite kind, but loud, chaotic, emotional. Some cried, some shouted. Some just stood in silence, overwhelmed. Outside, as the forum ended, the first bootleg videos began circulating again. Telegram, Rumble, anonymous Twitter accounts. Pirate copies of the forum multiplied by the minute. J.D. Vance didn't return to Washington that night. He vanished from public view. Some said he left for Ohio. Others claimed he boarded a private plane out of the country. But it didn't matter, because the next morning, the headlines were no longer about a senator kicked out of a restaurant. They were about the forum, the voices, the movement. Senator or saboteur. J.D. Vance breaks the fourth wall, the forum that Washington couldn't kill. Echo 19B, myth, model, or machine. Congress called for investigations. Major networks scrambled to explain their blackout. International media demanded answers. Thousands across the U.S. began organizing similar events, open forums, truth circles, town halls with no filters. And somewhere in a hidden room, someone updated a file marked Anvil response. Status: unstable. The story wasn't over. It had just started. And this time, it wasn't being written by those in power, but by those who chose to speak when silence was expected. The blacked out screen sent shockwaves through online communities. Across the U.S., millions who had waited to watch the unedited interview with Senator J.D. Vance were met with a cold, blunt message. This content has been restricted in your region. Within minutes, VPN searches surged. Hashtags like #WhyIsVanceBlocked, #MediaFirewall, and #BlackoutBroadcast trended globally. It was no longer just about a restaurant denial. It was about censorship, latent and deliberate. Inside the Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha, the control room was flooded with calls from international affiliates. European networks reported no issues. The feed was streaming clearly in London, Berlin, Sydney, even parts of South America. Only U.S. broadcasters had pulled the plug on. None could say exactly who had issued the order. J.D. Vance's office received no warning from regulators, no cease and desist letter, no statement from the FCC or any federal body. It was like someone had pressed a switch silently and powerfully. By morning, a small cable news station in Canada rebroadcast the full interview. Screenshots began leaking on social media. Transcripts surfaced. Independent journalists from Substack and X, formerly Twitter, published breakdowns of Vance's statements. And buried in the dialogue, readers noticed something chilling. Vance had mentioned an obscure federal program by name, Directive Echo 19B. Most viewers brushed past it. But in certain intelligence and policy circles, the term set off alarms. Directive Echo 19B wasn't public. It was supposed to be an internal post-insurrection monitoring system. It's created under a shadow clause of the Domestic Stability Act. It gave a classified joint task force the power to pre-screen and suppress media narratives deemed destabilizing to national cohesion. It wasn't just about national security anymore. It was about national perception. The senator's claim had touched a nerve and someone had reacted fast. Meanwhile, the Georgetown law student who recorded the original restaurant video, Mia Varela, found herself suddenly at the center of the storm. She had been scheduled for an interview on a local DC radio station. The segment was pulled 30 minutes before air. No reason given. That afternoon, she posted a long thread detailing what she had seen that night at the bistro. She included metadata from the original recording, timestamps, location, no edits, no filters. Then her account was locked. Screenshots of her tweets began circulating like wildfire. Reddit threads dissected every frame of the restaurant footage, from J.D. Vance's calm expression to the unease on the manager's face. One user noticed a man in the background near the exit wearing an earpiece, not reacting like a normal customer. That man showed up again. in footage from the hotel where Vance did the Al Jazeera interview. Same jacket, same watch, same blank. Stare online sleuths dubbed him the Shadow. Suddenly, this wasn't just a story about politics. It was starting to look like surveillance, covert interference, something bigger. At the Capitol, tensions rose. Senators from both sides began issuing public statements. Some distanced themselves from Vance, calling his media push reckless. Others defended his right to speak freely. Senator Elizabeth Kaine called for a Senate judiciary inquiry into Directive Echo 19B if it existed. That same day, Vance received an unmarked envelope at his office. Inside was a USB drive. No note, no return address. Just a black plastic casing and a red sticker, confidential E19B. His chief of staff stared at it. "Senator, are we opening this?" J.D. Vance took the drive, turned it over once, then nodded. "Not here. Not on any system in this building." They booked a private off-grid cabin in West Virginia that night. No cell towers, no internet, just one laptop and a generator. Inside, the drive were 3 files, a list of over 200 names journalists. Politicians, influencers marked with timestamps, and codes labeled deprioritized and offline suppression. A document titled Echo Chain. Internal Review Week 14 inches showing media monitoring reports. Ratings dips and narrative control grids. A 2-minute video, grainy but clear of a briefing inside a Homeland Security conference room. Man in a gray suit stood at the head of the table. His voice was calm but cold. "We are no longer in a state of information flow," he said. "We are in a state of information control. The line between threat and opinion is now irrelevant. Only cohesion matters." He paused. "If Senator Vance continues, apply black. Level contingency. We cannot risk domestic fragmentation before the summit." The clip ended. J.D. Vance leaned back in his chair, breath held. The international summit was 4 days away in Washington. Leaders from over 30 nations, including defense partners and intelligence chiefs, were about to arrive. And someone inside the U.S. government was preparing to silence one of its own senators. Not because he broke the law, but because he broke the script. The wind rustled through the trees outside the West Virginia cabin as J.D. Vance sat motionless. In front of the laptop, the screen had gone dark after the final frame of the leaked video. A cold silence filled the room. His chief of staff, Lila Torres, finally broke it. "We need to go public," she whispered. Vance didn't answer. His fingers tapped slowly on the wooden table. "Not yet," he finally said. "If we go too early, they'll bury it. Or us." Inside that USB drive was the closest thing to proof they had of a covert media manipulation operation, one that seemed to stretch across federal agencies, big tech platforms, and possibly even intelligence bodies. Echo 19B wasn't a myth. It was policy, and someone was actively enforcing it against him. He looked up. "We need allies, real ones, not on Twitter, not on talk shows, inside the system." The next morning, Vance returned quietly to D.C. No press, no handlers, just Leela and a single folder copies of the files from the USB. He arranged a meeting with Senator Roy Chen, an old rival turned cautious friend. Chen, a military veteran with decades in defense intelligence committees, was known for discretion. They met in the subbasement of the Russell Senate office building in a disused storage corridor that hadn't been used for official meetings in years. No cameras, no microphones. Chen read the documents, his brow tightening. "This is bad," he muttered. "Really bad?" "Is it real?" Vance asked. Chen nodded slowly. "To real. I saw references to black level in a closed-door hearing once. No context. But the language cohesion over opinion, that's a red flag in every intelligence training manual I ever saw." Vance leaned forward. "So what do we do?" Chen looked around and then said something that made Vance's stomach twist. "You can't trust Congress. Not anymore." Some of them are in this whether they know it or not. Back at his Senate office, J.D. Vance found something waiting on his desk that hadn't been there before. A manila envelope marked with the Department of Justice seal but no sender name. Inside, a single page, a summons, a closed session interview. Request by the Federal Continuity Task Force, a unit most members of the public didn't even know existed. It was scheduled for the next morning, no option to decline. "They're trying to box you in," Lila said, reading over his shoulder. "Or flip me," Vance replied. That night, he made a decision. He called Al Jazeera again, not for another interview, but for help. He asked to meet with one of their investigative journalists, Noura Haddad, who had contacts across the intelligence community in Europe and the Middle East. She agreed, flying in under diplomatic protection as part of a Qatari delegation arriving for the summit. They met at a secure room in the embassy. Nora listened intently as Vance laid everything out. She didn't blink. "I've seen worse," she said. "But not inside the U.S., not this bold, not this fast." She offered to publish an expose, but Vance declined. "Not yet. I need to shake the tree first. See who tries to stop me." The next day, he walked into the closed DOJ session. No cameras, no aides. Just for men and women in dark suits sitting behind a long metal table. The American flag behind them seemed to droop under the weight of the silence. One man leaned forward. "Senator Vance, do you understand why you're here today?" Vance nodded. "I have a feeling." They didn't mention Echo 19B directly, but they circled it, referencing destabilizing influence, Prevails triggers, narrative risks. One of them asked directly whether he had been in contact with any foreign journalists. Vance looked him in the eye. "Yes, I met with Al Jazeera last night. I'm meeting with a BBC team later this week. It's still a democracy, isn't it?" The woman to his left closed her folder a little too quickly. The tone changed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Senator," one of them said. Vance didn't flinch. "No, you are." The session ended without arrest, without direct threats, but the message was clear. Stop. Now, that evening, a story broke on a fringe news site. It alleged that J.D. Vance had been in contact with foreign intelligence and potentially compromised. The article had no byline. It referenced no sources. But it was immediately picked up by a few bots and amplified across dark corners of the web. The smear campaign had begun, but so had something else. Within an hour, 3 other senators, quiet ones, from purple states, reached out to Vance privately. They had seen the clip. They had heard whispers of Echo 19B before, but never had proof. "You have it now," Vance said. "What are you going to do about it?" They didn't answer right away. But one of them sent him something unexpected. A floor schedule for the summit's opening day. Highlighted in red was a surprise. Edition, closed, national security. The Capitol dome gleamed under the afternoon sun, but inside the secure congressional chamber, the mood was heavy. J.D. Vance stood outside room SB 127, a classified hearing room deep beneath the Senate. He wasn't scheduled to speak. He wasn't even supposed to be there. But a junior clerk sympathetic to his cause had slipped him a temporary access badge. The moment was closing in. Inside that room, Special Counsel Jonathan Mears was about to present a national security briefing to the Senate leadership. Vance knew what it really was, a masterclass in narrative control, an attempt to justify Echo 19B, or as insiders now called it, the Trust Protocol. The doors sealed behind him with a dull thud. Only a few aides had clearance. Phones were banned, recordings forbidden. The atmosphere was clinical, almost surgical. Mears stood before the senators in a gray 3-piece suit. He didn't look like a spy. He looked like a banker who'd wandered into a courtroom. Calm, articulate, and completely devoid of expression. His voice was cold as he spoke. "We live in an era where disinformation travels faster than missiles, where emotional content has more impact than nuclear arsenals. The trust protocol is not censorship, it's preemption. He clicked a remote. A screen behind him lit up with colored maps, data points, facial recognition grids, social media spikes. I generated trajectory models. Then came the phrase Vance had heard before, but never this clearly. Narrative threat threshold. MEARS. Continued when a public figure introduces destabilizing ideas into public discourse, especially ones backed by foreign media. Radical online movements or unvetted grassroots cells. They trigger a threat threshold. Our job isn't to silence, it's to recalibrate. Recalibrate what? A senator finally asked. The public sense of reality, Mears said flatly. J.D. Vance felt the air leave the room. He looked around. Only a few senators flinched. Most nodded slowly, taking notes, not questioning, absorbing the meeting adjourned 30 minutes later. No votes were taken. No laws passed. But the course of national narrative policy had just been affirmed behind closed doors. Back in his office, Vance threw off his jacket and slammed the door. They're not hiding it anymore, he muttered to Lila. They think they're protecting the country, but they're programming it. Lila nodded grimly. And if we say anything, they'll paint us as foreign pawns. Just then, her phone buzzed. A message flashed on screen. Check out CNN in 60 seconds. They're moving early. Vance reached for the remote and turned on the muted television. The CNN banner read, "Breaking leaked files suggest Senator J.D. Vance may have shared classified intel abroad." The host, in a concerned tone, explained that unnamed officials were alarmed at Vance's meetings with international journalists. They played a pixelated, context-free clip of him with Noura Haddad, edited to seem conspiratorial. The voiceover warned of a coordinated foreign messaging campaign operating under the guise of political dissent. That's not just a hit piece, Lila said. That's a pre-indictment. Vance turned off the TV. They want me gone. But he had one card left. It's a full, unedited copy of the Ecto-19B briefing. Video secretly recorded through a rogue device hidden by a staffer from Chen's office. They hadn't shared it yet. They weren't even sure it could be authenticated publicly without revealing the source, until now. Vance opened a secure line and called Noura. It's time. That night, as media coverage spun stories of betrayal, a new upload appeared online. Anonymous. Quiet. No clickbait. Just one title. The Protocol They Don't Want You to Know. It was raw, uncut. Mears' entire classified presentation with subtitles and timestamps. Within hours, it exploded across encrypted forums, then Reddit, then eventually X and YouTube before being repeatedly taken down. The takedowns only made it more viral. By sunrise, hashtags like #TrustProtocol, #Echo19B, and #NarrativeControl were trending globally. And suddenly, J.D. Vance was no longer alone. Protests began forming outside federal buildings, not in anger, but in curiosity. Students, journalists, war veterans, librarians, people who'd never heard of J.D. Vance were now demanding transparency about Echo-19B. But there was also backlash. By mid-morning, the FBI had shown up at his office. "We'd like to ask a few questions, Senator," the agent said calmly, badge in hand. J.D. Vance stood tall, buttoned his coat, and looked him in the eye. "Sure," he said. "But this time, I'm recording everything." It was just after 8 p.m. when J.D. Vance was escorted into a quiet, heavily secured conference room on the 5th floor of the Hoover Building. The walls were paneled in gray acoustic foam. No windows. One camera. No phones allowed. The room felt less like a federal office and more like a bunker meant to contain uncomfortable truths. Two agents were waiting, Agent Ramirez and Agent Dean. They didn't introduce themselves again. No need. J.D. Vance had met them both years ago during a Senate oversight hearing on federal surveillance powers. Now, they sat across from him with a stack of manila folders and a steel pitcher of water that no one touched. "We're not charging you," Ramirez said flatly. Yet Dean leaned forward. We need to talk about the leak. Vance didn't blink. The leak that exposed a classified propaganda framework targeting U.S. citizens. Ramirez sighed. Senate, we're not here to debate policy. We're here because your name is now attached to something much larger than politics. They slid a photo across the table. A blurry image of a masked figure entering the back door of a data center in Northern Virginia. Then another Noura Haddad boarding a flight to Berlin. Then another an internal memo marked for eyes only with the subject line, Project Anvil. Project Anvil is not Ecto-19B, Dean said. It's what Ecto-19B was meant to stop. JD scanned the memo quickly. Anvil wasn't a U.S. initiative. It was a foreign operation believed to be funded by a loosely connected alliance of media outlets, digital cryptography firms, and ex-intelligence operatives. Their aim: flood unstable democracies with truth, lies, and everything in between. Blur the line between state and story. The idea, Ramirez added, isn't to make you believe a lie. It's to make you stop believing anything at all. JD leaned back, his thoughts racing. So you're saying I was a pawn? That Noura's just an agent? Dean shook his head. No. We're saying you are now a fulcrum. If this spins further, you're the man that brings down trust not in government. Not in policy, but in reality itself. There was a long silence. Then Ramirez spoke, quieter this time. There's a deal being drafted. You distance yourself from the leak. You denounce the video as edited and incomplete. In return, no charges. No public hearings. You finish your term, you walk away. Vance looked down at his hands. For a brief second, he imagined peace, a clean exit, a quiet life. But that wasn't the country he grew up in, and it sure wasn't the one he wanted to leave behind. He stood up slowly. You know why the video went viral? Dean frowned. Because people love scandal. No, JD replied, because they're starving for something real. He walked out before they could respond. That night, in a dimly lit safe house in Alexandria, JD met with Noura and Lila. The walls were covered in whiteboards, printed screenshots, and strings connecting news outlets, politicians, AI accounts, and media regulators. I know about Project Anvil, JD said quietly. Noura didn't deny it, and I know they'll discredit everything we say, paint it as foreign propaganda. But we still have one shot. He opened a laptop and showed them a new folder. Witnesses, former staffers from the Ecto-19B program. Low-level contractors, internal auditors. People with nothing to gain except maybe their conscience. Lila's eyes widened. How did you get these names? I asked the one person still inside who hasn't picked a side yet, JD said. Senator Chen. That changed everything. Chen had been quiet for weeks, neither defending JD nor condemning him. But behind the scenes, he had started forwarding names, dates, and even private session transcripts. He hadn't declared a side, but he'd given JD the only thing that mattered: access. The plan was simple. Not a leak, not a protest. Not another YouTube video. A live, unedited, unmoderated forum. They would host it in 3 days. A university auditorium in Baltimore. The event would be streamed over a decentralized broadcast platform resistant to takedowns. The title, America Decides, a forum on power, truth, and control. Anyone could attend. Media could film it. Senators were invited. No teleprompters, no filters. The stage would be open to every participant willing to identify themselves, state their background, and speak for 5 minutes. The final guest, JD Vance. 2 days later, in the dead of night, a black SUV pulled up outside Vance's townhouse. A courier emerged, face unreadable, and handed him an envelope. Inside were just 2 words: don't speak. But for JD, the decision had already been made. He burned the envelope, packed a single bag, and looked at Lila. Time to find out, he said, how deep this really goes. It began under gray skies in Baltimore. The university auditorium was packed students with cameras. Journalists clutching notebooks, quiet government observers in pressed suits lining the back rows. Outside, protesters clashed with counter-protesters. Inside, a sense of unease settled over the crowd. Everyone knew something unusual was about to happen. There was no moderator, no polished introduction, just a spotlight on a bare stage and a microphone. At precisely 7 p.m., J.D. Vance stepped into the light. He didn't wear a tie. His sleeves were rolled up. He looked tired but determined. The murmurs in the room faded to silence. He didn't start with a speech. He simply said, "Tonight, you won't hear from politicians. You'll hear from people who've lived the truth. Most of us are too afraid to admit." Then he stepped aside. One by one, the witnesses came forward. First, a former systems analyst from a government subcontractor described how keyword tracking AIs were trained not just to detect threats, but to reshape search results based on political sentiment. Then, a linguist once employed by a federal data initiative spoke about how language models were subtly adjusted to discredit opposing views, shifting entire online debates without ever drawing attention. A third speaker, young and nervous, admitted to working on Echo 19B, his job, writing correction narratives designed to drown out leaks with noise. His voice trembled as he explained how they created hundreds of fake Reddit accounts to overwhelm any thread that questioned government transparency. The audience shifted, uneasy. The fourth speaker refused to give her real name. Her face was blurred on the live stream. She claimed to be a foreign national who had once worked with Project Anvil. "You think it's about free speech?" She said. "No. It's about controlling doubt itself. If people don't know what to believe, they become easier to steer." That was when the feed flickered. For viewers online, the stream cut out, replaced with a blue screen and the message, "Connection lost. Please refresh." But inside the room, the mic still worked. The cameras were still rolling. Independent journalists scrambled to preserve their footage. J.D. Vance stepped back to the mic. He looked out at the audience and paused. His voice, when it came, was low and calm. "We knew this might happen," he said. "We knew they'd try to shut this down." He held up a flash drive. "But every word spoken here tonight is saved, encrypted, distributed. And tomorrow, it will be. Everywhere." He looked straight into the cameras. "I don't care if you believe me, but believe this: what we allow to be buried today becomes the blueprint for what controls us tomorrow." At that moment, several figures began moving toward the stage. Security officials. No one was sure. The room tensed. But then something happened. One of the security guards stepped aside. Then another, and another. They weren't there to stop him. They were protecting him. The last speaker of the night was a teenage girl, a college freshman. She had no ties to politics, no job in government. She simply said, "I used to think truth was whatever people shouted the loudest. No, I realize truth is what they try hardest to erase." The room stood still, then came applause. Not the polite kind, but loud, chaotic, emotional. Some cried, some shouted. Some just stood in silence, overwhelmed. Outside, as the forum ended, the first bootleg videos began circulating again. Telegram, Rumble, anonymous Twitter accounts, pirate copies of the forum multiplied by the minute. J.D. Vance didn't return to Washington that night. He vanished from public view. Some said he left for Ohio. Others claimed he boarded a private plane out of the country. But it didn't matter, because the next morning, the headlines were no longer about a senator kicked out of a restaurant. They were about the forum. The voices, the movement. Senator or saboteur? J.D. Vance breaks the fourth wall. The forum that Washington couldn't kill. Co 19B. Myth, model, or machine? Congress called for investigations. Major networks scrambled to explain their blackout. International media demanded answers. Thousands across the U.S. began organizing similar events, open forums, truth circles, town halls with no filters. And somewhere in a hidden room, someone updated a file marked Anvil Response. Status unstable. The story wasn't over. It had just started. And this time, it wasn't being written by those in power, but by those who chose to speak when. Silence was expected.